All right, well, let me go ahead and get us started with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we once again thank you for an opportunity to gather together and study your word. Lord, how much truth, how much power, how much beauty is in your inspired words, Lord. Pray as we dive into Isaiah 40 that you would open the eyes of our hearts to the truth of your scriptures, that you would illuminate the truth for us, that we might understand you better, we might understand your plan better, we might understand our place in it better. Lord, bless this study. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, as I said, we are going to be looking at Isaiah 40, last one for the year, and we got a nice long one to go over. So let me start off by reading it for us. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice says, cry out. And I said, what shall I cry? All peoples are like grass, and all their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God endures forever. You who bring good news to Zion, go up on a high mountain. You who bring good news to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout. Lift it up, do not be afraid. Say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. See, the sovereign Lord comes with power, and he rules with a mighty arm. See, his reward is with him, and his recompense accompanies him. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord, or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him, and who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed him the path of understanding? Surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him all nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. With whom then will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? As for an idol, a metal worker casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and fashions silver chains for it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold. I'm sorry, I lost my place there, repeated that. Fashions a silver chain for it. A person too poor to present such an offering selects wood that will not rot. They look for a skilled worker to set up an idol that will not topple. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name, because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. This is the word of the Lord. So as we start here with chapter 40, this is really the first chapter of the second half of the book. So 1 to 39 were kind of the first major section, and now 40 through 66 are the second major section. So what would you say is kind of the overarching theme, the overarching message of this next section of the book that we're going to be looking at? Okay, pointing to the Messiah. Right. Okay. Right, okay. Reference to the Messiah. Good. Any other thoughts? Comfort? Sure, absolutely. Comfort for God's people. Yeah, good. So, if we understand that the first half of the book culminated with chapter 39, and in chapter 39 we see Isaiah's prophecy that Judah would be conquered and Jerusalem destroyed by Babylon, then the second half of the book here, beginning with chapter 40, is expounding on that reality. John Oswalt writes, quote, "What does it mean that God would have delivered from Assyria would not deliver from Babylon? Would he still be trustworthy? Would he still be the Holy One like whom there is no other? Would he still be the Lord of the nations who has history under his control? Would an Israel so sinful that it can no longer continue in the promised land still have a place in God's cosmic plans? Would Zion's election be only temporary, or would it be doomed to be replaced by great Babylon, mistress of the world? What about the ancient Torah and the later covenant with David? Would these be abrogated? There are these and many other questions like them spring naturally to mind in view of the circumstances of the exile." End quote. So what we see then is that Isaiah, as the prophet of the Lord, he's been given foreknowledge of the coming Babylonian exile. And in the second half of his book, he begins to address the problem of this coming exile. And he begins to address the problem of the coming exile in light of what he's been preaching the whole time, the need to trust in the Lord. Brian Beyer notes, quote, "Gone is the threat of Assyria. Instead, the prophetic word ushers the people home from Babylon. Promises of judgment comprise a seemingly distant memory as promises of hope and renewal gush forth. The focus shifts largely to the future and the exciting things the prophet expects God to do after the Babylonian exile. Isaiah 40 to 66 focuses primarily on three themes. The first two appear more commonly in the earlier chapters, while the third appears throughout. The three themes are as follows. 1, God's people are in captivity because of their sins. 2, the captivity proves God is God because he predicted it. 3, God will now redeem his people through Cyrus and in other ways. So what we see then from chapter 40 through the end of the book is this intent focus on, for Isaiah, the future Babylonian exile, what that means, what the implications of that are, and how God's going to work through the exile and through the deliverance of his people. So then as we kind of zoom in from that broader look at 40 to 66 and zoom in really to the immediate section, chapters 40 to 48, there's a distinct kind of theme running through the first 8 chapters that's introduced really in chapter 40. So any ideas on kind of what the message theme of chapters 40 to 48 specifically is? All right, so John Oswalt explains, he writes, quote, "Isaiah's answers to the questions that the exile would pose about the character of God are as stirring as his poetry. In ringing assertions, Isaiah declares that just as Assyria was a tool in the hand of God, so will Babylon be. The Lord, not Bel or Nebo, is the master of history. Babylon's destruction is as sure as Assyria's was before it, because God has already ordained its conqueror. Indeed, the exile will show that God is incomparable. There is no God like him, able to explain the past, Creator, able to tell the future, Lord, able to do a brand new thing, Redeemer. Furthermore, God not only has the ability to deliver, but he also wants to do so. Far from having given up on his people because of their sins, he intends to use their lives as incontrovertible evidence of his sole deity. Over and over, he tells the captives not to be afraid, but to trust him to do something previously unheard of, restore a people from exile. As Yahweh's chosen servants, they will demonstrate to the world that he is truly God and that he is the only Savior. They must believe that he has not abandoned them." End quote. And Derek Kidner also elaborates kind of on the theme of these chapters. He writes, quote, "We emerge in 41 in a different world from Hezekiah's, immersed in the situation foretold in 39:5-8, which he was so thankful to escape. Nothing is said of the intervening century and a half. We wake, so to speak, on the far side of the disaster, impatient for the end of captivity. In chapters 40-48, liberation is in the air. There is the persistent promise of a new exodus, with God as its head. There is the approach of a conqueror, eventually disclosed as Cyrus, to break Babylon open. There is also a new theme unfolding to reveal the glory of the call to be a servant and a light to the nations. All this is expressed with a soaring, exultant eloquence in a style heard only fitfully hitherto, but now sustained so as to give its distinctive tone to the remaining chapters of the book." End quote. So what we see from these two quotes by these Bible scholars is that the overall message, the overall theme of chapters 40-48 is the fact that God's people will be delivered from their exile in Babylon. And in both their exile and their deliverance, God will reveal himself to be unlike any other so-called God. The main point for God's people is in the last line of John Oswalt's quote. Isaiah wants the people of Judah to know that even in the face of Babylonian exile, God has not abandoned them. So as we look at chapter 40 specifically, it kind of exists in two big sections. The first one being verses 1-11. But as we always do, we break it down into kind of subsections so we can digest it a little easier. So let's look first at verses 1-5. What stands out to you in those 5 verses?
To me, number 5, what stands out to me is, "And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed; all flesh will see it together."
Yeah,
That stands out to me.
absolutely. Yeah, the glory of the Lord will be revealed and all people will see it together. Yeah, that's important. It's good. Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Getting ready for what? The monarch. I am not sure what that means. When they got back from the Babylonian exile, I guess they did have kings still. Maybe the monarch is a reference to Jesus. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what they're referring to there. Yes. Okay. Any other thoughts on the first 5 verses?
Very common to comfort, all put it all together.
Mhm.
It's very encouraging.
You're right. Very positive and encouraging. Absolutely.
That he loves us too.
Right. Yep. It shows us that he loves us.
I learned that with my niece today. Said God really loves you.
That's right. God does really love you. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So encouraging the people in their faith, as you said, like going into battle, a captain encouraging his troops, encouraging people to have faith and to trust in the Lord because he can accomplish great things. Good. Good. Yeah, all really good answers. So John Oswalt says that verses 1 to 2 actually set the tone for the next 27 chapters. He writes, quote, "Whatever may lie ahead for the people of Judah and Jerusalem, God's ultimate purpose for them is not destruction but redemption, not death but life. The two verses achieve a warm and affectionate note from the opening words through the assurance that all is paid, all is forgiven. These will be recurring themes of the ensuing chapters, the fact and the means of restoration." So in verse 1, Isaiah pronounces comfort over the people of God, and he repeats the word comfort for emphasis. He doesn't just say it once, he says it twice. So God, through Isaiah, wants to remind the people of his ultimate tenderness, his ultimate kindness with this expression of compassion and concern. He wants them to know he's not going to forget the promises he made to their ancestors. Verse 2 then lays out why the people should take comfort. They have endured the suffering that was the punishment for their sins, and so now God has forgiven them and will deliver and restore them. So since the service has been completed, God's people have nothing more to fear from God's hand. In verses 3 to 5, they outline exactly how this pronouncement of comfort can be given to people who have been conquered and exiled, right? In the ancient world, having your nation conquered and you being shipped off into exile, that was basically it. You were done. There was no coming back from that. So how can Isaiah pronounce these words of hope and encouragement to people who have been conquered in exile? Well, these verses, 3 to 5, show us that comfort comes only through the activity of God, not from any works or any merit on the part of the people. In verse 3, we see that an unknown messenger is making a declaration. We aren't privy to who this messenger is, and a lot of people have come up with a lot of ideas, but it's all just speculation. And the bottom line is it's irrelevant who the messenger is. What matters is the message. First, in verse 3, this messenger says, "In the wilderness prepare the way for the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." Now there's some debate regarding the metaphor being used here, but what seems the most likely is that this is referring to God coming from his distant residence on Mount Sinai to Babylon to help his people. In verse 4, the unknown messenger declares, "Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low, the rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain." So this is a command for the people to prepare the way for the coming king. Oswald explains, quote, "It speaks of an act of faith on the part of the people. They do not yet see the king, but they dare to believe that he's coming. It also speaks of some form of activity on the part of those who had formerly been paralyzed by discouragement and hopelessness." End quote. And in verse 5, the unknown messenger says, "And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." This is a declaration of the result of the coming of the Lord. When he comes, his glory will be revealed. It's through the work he will do on behalf of his exiled people in Babylon that will display his glory for all people to see. And the people can be assured of this. Why? Because it was spoken by the Lord, and the Lord's word is never failing. So as we move then into the next subsection, we're kind of looking here at verses 6 to 8. So what stands out to you in verses 6, 7, and 8?
The same thing has been going on all the way back from the beginning of Isaiah, that the humans that don't have what it takes
Okay.
and go to God for the answer.
Right.
Because we just don't have what it takes.
Right, okay. Humans don't have what it takes, so they need to go to God for the answers. Good. Any other thoughts on 6 to 8?
It's comparing us, our humanity, to God, how we're insignificant and
Okay.
both sections. It's not, every person is the same and compared to God.
Okay. Yeah, so comparing humanity to deity, comparing people to God, and how we don't measure up. Good. Yeah, good. So in verse 6, we see that the unknown voice, and it's probably the same voice from the previous verses, tells Isaiah to cry out. When Isaiah then asks what he's supposed to cry out, the voice begins first with, all people are like grass, and their faithfulness is like the flowers of the field. And then in verses 7 to 8, he'll explain what he means when he says that. The message Isaiah is supposed to deliver continues in verse 7. The grass withers and the flowers fall because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass. We know that plants, such as grass and flowers, they're feeble. They grow quickly, they wither quickly. Carla loves getting flowers. I don't love buying them for her because I feel like I just flush money down the toilet because they're dead 3 days later. They're temporal. They're very alive 1 minute, dead the next. And humans are the same way. Our nature is very similar to that in the realm of eternity. Again, Oswald explains, quote, the prophet probably has in mind here the imagery of the Hamsun, a hot, dry wind from the east that is likely to blow in May and that can turn the countryside from green to brown in 48 hours or less. But what turns the grass brown here is not merely wind, it is the breath of the Lord. By using the Hebrew word ruah, the prophet is able to draw upon all the connotations from breath to wind to lowercase spirit to capital spirit. Just as God was present through his Spirit to create the world, so it is through the Spirit that his impassible reality is now present among us, forever calling a halt to our human pretensions. End quote. And this thinking applies to all humanity. The Babylonians who oppress God's people will not be able to prevent God from delivering his people, nor are God's people able to deliver themselves. The point is, as Carla said, all people are weak and insufficient in comparison to God. Babylonians, Israelites, it doesn't matter. And that truth is brought out even more in verse 8, when the message concludes with, the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of God endures forever. God is eternal and humanity is temporal. He is so much more than we could possibly be. Then we move into the end of this first section, verses 9 to 11. What stands out to you in those 3 verses?
And verse 9 says, do not be afraid. So they're being told to have confidence and trust that God will do as he says. So they should not be afraid and go forward and tell others confidently.
Okay? Don't be afraid. Go forward and tell others confidently because God's in control and they can trust in him. Good. Any other thoughts? All right, well, so these verses, they represent a shift from the words of the unknown messenger of the previous verses to Isaiah's own exhortations to his people. In verse 9, Isaiah commands the people to not be afraid, but to lift up their voices with shouting and declare God to the cities of Judah. The point of this command is that all people should become like prophets, declaring God's activity to everyone. In verse 10, Isaiah calls the people's attention to what God is doing by twice repeating the command, see. The first thing they are to see is that God comes in power and rules in might. His mighty arm is a reference to him defeating his enemies and ruling in power. The second thing they are to see is that his reward is with him and his recompense accompanies him. Now, the exact meaning of that particular subsection there is debated. It's uncertain. There are 2 major possibilities. One It could mean that the Lord will bring all of the spoils of his victory and all his wages as a soldier with him and distribute those things among the people. 2, it could mean that the payment that the Lord receives for his victory is his redeemed people, and that he comes bringing them with him. But I'm more inclined to agree with the scholars who say that the second section of verse 10 is simply part of the military picture presented in the verse, and it just refers to the overall spoils of victory, whatever they may be. I think that's better than trying to be overly literal and interpreting exactly what the recompense is. In verse 11, the imagery changes from God as a conquering soldier to God as a caretaking shepherd. God's disposition toward his enemies is wrath, judgment, destruction. But his attitude towards his people is comfort, compassion, protection, provision, love. Oswald expounds, quote, "In the previous 39 chapters, the prophet has shown how one can depend on God to bring judgment on those who break his covenant. Now he begins to show how one can equally depend on God to defend and care for those who will turn to him." End quote. So now that we've got through the first 11 verses, that's kind of the first section. So how do all of these verses we've been talking about, how do they fit together to form a unified section? What is the message of the first 11 verses as a whole?
Better times are coming for sure.
Okay, yep. Better times are coming. Okay, be faithful because God's in control. Good.
You think some of this refers to Christ's second coming? When Christ came the first time, as far as Israel was concerned, there wasn't too dead on a response, you know.
Right.
And but when it comes back the second time, you'll be a little more.
Well, I think there are certainly, images of the second coming here. When it says, for example, in verse 5, "And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together." That certainly calls to mind the second coming of Christ. So I certainly think some of that is present here.
Yeah, he does say he's coming in his glory.
Right.
He says he won't share his glory with no man, but he will give his glory to us.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that he's coming in his glory.
Right. Absolutely.
There's a one about, I saw on Israel last Sunday before he came to church. They said, Pat said it about Israel, but he said he doesn't want Israel to be alone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, so basically how this goes together, verses 1 to 5 exhort God's people in exile to take comfort because God is coming to save them. He hasn't forgotten his promises. He will deliver them from their oppressors now that they've served the punishment for their sins. Verses 6 to 8 then provide a contrast with verses 1 to 5. In verses 1 to 5, we're shown the eternal power, the eternal glory of the King. Nothing, not deserts or mountains or valleys, nothing can stop his march to help his people. But in verses 6 to 8, we're shown, in contrast to that, the feeble and temporal nature of humanity. Humanity can neither save itself nor hinder the one who determines to save, Oswald writes. Verses 9 to 11, then, in those verses, Isaiah concludes this section by exhorting the people to become part of the great work God is doing. God is saving the people of Judah. God is taking care of them, not just for their sake, but for the sake of showing his glory to the world. So the people of Judah need to become part of that by sharing it. We then move into the second section of the chapter, which is the rest of the chapter. So let's break it down a little bit. Let's look first at verses 12 to 17. Well, that's kind of the first subsection here of the second section. What stands out to you in those verses 12 to 17?
From 12 to 14, they're practically rhetorical questions.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
You know, who can do this and who can do that? And it's like, well, no one, only, only the Creator. Nobody is on this earth, nobody ever is instructing God. God is the Creator and the instructor, and, so they're all rhetorical questions. It's only God.
Right.
And then 16, 17 talks about offerings and basically, there's not enough on this earth that can ever provide a sufficient amount to God. So He's the only one that is the means to our salvation. We can't bring Him enough offerings to earn our salvation. So He has to send Jesus.
Okay.
Who is our salvation.
Great. Good.
Reminds me of Job when God says, where were you when I made all this stuff and whatever on that?
Right. Yeah.
It's only, God can do everything and do nothing.
Right. Right. Good. Yeah, good. So, as Carla rightly pointed out, verse 12 begins a series of rhetorical questions. And the point of the rhetorical questions is to stress the uniqueness of the God of Israel and Judah. The questions in verse 12 specifically are meant to highlight that God is the creator of heaven and earth, that it all came from His hand and He transcends it as Lord over it. Though the questions are rhetorical, they are meant to elicit the answer in the minds of the readers. Right? The answer is, surely no one but God did these things. In verse 13, Isaiah is again focusing on the fact that the Lord is so far above humanity when he asks, who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Again, the rhetorical question is supposed to elicit the answer. No one from the readers. No one can fathom the Lord's Spirit. No one can instruct him as a counselor. Right? No mere human is able to fully comprehend who God is or his mind. So no one is equipped to teach him or counsel him about anything. There's no human or heavenly counselor for God because God transcends all other beings in every aspect. In verse 14, Isaiah continues the line of questioning from verse 13 by asking a series of questions about who taught and counseled God. Again, Isaiah is leading his readers to the answer. No one taught God. No one counseled him. No one showed him anything because he's God. God's plan for the world, God's plan for all reality came only from his independent mind and his independent will. In verses 15 to 17, Isaiah then shifts from using rhetorical questions to making straight assertions regarding the fact that no nation comes close to being comparable to God. The metaphors of verse 15 focus on the smallness of the nations in relation to God. The nations are nothing more than a single drop in a bucket full of water. They are dust on a scale, while God is so great he weighs entire islands as if they were nothing more than dust particles. In verse 16, then, Lebanon is used to typify all nations and their insufficiency in the eyes of God. Lebanon was known for its vast cedar forests. So Isaiah is saying that God is so great that even all the cedar in Lebanon is not sufficient for providing the types of sacrifices that he deserves. Further, the vast forests in Lebanon meant there was abundant wildlife living there. So again, Isaiah is saying that God is so great that even the vast array of animals living in Lebanon is insufficient for the types of sacrifices that he deserves. And I think Carla is right that you can then extrapolate from that. If there's nothing on earth that's sufficient for the sacrifice God deserves, God has to make that sacrifice possible, and he does so in Jesus. In verse 17, Isaiah drops the metaphor, he drops the typology, and just comes out and plainly says what he means. In comparison to the greatness of God, all nations of the earth are worthless. They are less than nothing. That's a pretty bold statement. God's not merely greater than the nations of man. He's on a whole other plane of existence. He is wholly other than humanity. Now, Isaiah is saying here that the nations are worthless, that they're less than nothing. He's not saying that God thinks the nations are worthless. Right? The Bible makes it pretty clear that all nations do have worth to God. Instead, it's Isaiah using hyperbole to highlight how great, how transcendent, how other God truly is. In comparison to him, nations are nothing. As we move then into the second subsection, we're looking at verses 18 to 20. So what stands out to you in those three verses? Okay? Okay? Right. Right. None of the idols of man can compare to God. Good. Good. Absolutely.
This section made me think about how you say all the time, men are fallible, how you say, we're in an airplane right now, and man created this, and, it could go away. I've heard you say things like that before. This is what it made me think of is, we could never create something as perfect as God.
Right.
It's foolish to think that you could ever have an idol.
Right.
That's even where comparable. And because we make mistakes, and for many reasons we could never make anything like that.
Okay. We could never make anything comparable to God. Good.
Well, and what we think is worth in our humanistic, like gold and silver and wood and all that, has really no value.
Right.
It's pointless.
Right. What we place value in earthly wise really doesn't have any ultimate value. Right. And to defend myself, I'm not a nervous flyer, but I am keenly aware when I'm in an airplane that is built and maintained by humans who make mistakes. And I am 35,000 feet in the air going 500 miles in a metal tube designed by people who make mistakes. That is always in my mind when I fly.
You're not in control of it.
Right.
I've been in there, and it's not you.
Right, exactly.
I've heard all these words before.
What you're supposed to think is God's in control, and if it's my time to go, so be it.
Well, that's valid as well. That's valid as well, but it doesn't escape my mind, the situation that I find myself in. All right, good. We digress. Anything else on 18 and 20?
That's all I got.
Yeah, so good. So these verses serve as a sort of conclusion to the arguments Isaiah made in the previous section. In verse 18, he again returns to the use of rhetorical questions. Right? He's essentially saying, since everything I have just written about God is true, who could you possibly compare him to? How could you possibly use anything earthly as an image of him? Of course, the answer is again supposed to be no one and nothing. In verses 19 and 20, Isaiah expands on the issue of making likenesses of God by focusing specifically on idols and how inherently foolish, ridiculous, and sinful they are. He emphasizes how idols are made to show that they're made with human hands and they're made out of earthly materials. How foolish it is to worship an image that was made by someone who was created by God, using materials that were created by God, using creations to try to represent the Creator. Klaus Balzer writes, quote, "The text is meant to raise a laugh, for the enterprise described is so ridiculous in the light of all that the living God is," end quote. Moving on then into the next subsection, verses 21 to 24, what stands out to you in those verses?
Verse 22 kind of indicates the world is not flat.
Okay.
It's a circle in there.
Okay. Fair enough.
God's big, we're little.
Okay, God's big, we're little.
Like grasshoppers.
Yeah. Good.
And he's in control. He reduces the rulers to nothing.
Okay.
Really.
He's in control, reduces the rulers to nothing. Yeah, good. So these verses really hammer home the point that God is not just Lord of creation, He's Lord over creation. Verse 21 contains another series of rhetorical questions which Isaiah is using to remind the people that they already know and they have long known everything that he's saying. God has made himself known from the very beginning, from the moment he began to create. Verses 22 and 23 again then deal with God's transcendence and its implications. In verse 22, Isaiah once more stresses the otherness of God. He sits on his throne above the earth, to the point that humans are as small as grasshoppers. Moreover, the very heavens themselves, the sky, is nothing more than a tent or a canopy that God stretches out as a shelter for his people. In verse 23, Isaiah stresses the greatness of God by highlighting how he is Lord over even the rulers of the world. Right? The rulers of the earth are seen as mighty, powerful, they're important, they're the rulers. But even they are subservient to God and pale in comparison to him. And verse 24 carries on the thought of verse 23, and Isaiah uses similar language here that he did in verses 6 to 8. The overarching point being how feeble, how fleeting humanity is in comparison to the power and the eternality of God. Moving then into the next couple of verses, verse 25 and 26, that's kind of our next little subsection. What stands out to you in those two verses?
Oh, right here. Who do you compare me with again?
Yeah.
You know, I was thinking about that when you mentioned it earlier, but we moved quickly onto that. So one of the things that I do think that I remembered in the Bible is about the Lord David. You know, when he picked David as to be a king, I thought that he said it was a man after his own heart. I don't know why I remember that phrase.
Yeah, David is held up in Scripture as being kind of the pinnacle of humanity. However, he's still not comparable to God.
No.
He's still not equal to God.
Well, he asked, who would you compare me to?
Right, but you can't even compare him to David.
Can you compare me? He just said, who would you?
Yeah, well, I think that might be nitpicking the translation a little bit there. But the point is that there's nobody. Even great King David, even rich and wise Solomon, even Paul, who wrote so much of the New Testament, none of them are anywhere close to being comparable to God. Carla, did you have something?
God said that he's now called the Holy One.
Okay.
In this verse, it's a way of separating him again, his holiness above all.
Okay. Calling him the Holy One is a way of separating him as his holiness above everyone else. Good.
Look up into the heavens.
Okay.
And he knows everything, every star by name, and he calls them forth in his great power. And I like that it says, and not one of them is missing. Like we would know.
Yeah.
What does that mean? He knows.
Right. He knows.
He knows. It's like
Right. It goes back.
there's that. That's used in other scriptures.
Yeah, and it's very similar to he knows the number of hairs on your head. Right? Have you ever tried to count the hairs on your head? It's an impossible task. I've never tried, but I know it's an impossible task. But God knows. I'm going to get up to heaven and be like, God, how many hairs did I have on my head? Just out of curiosity. That's right. So good, yeah. So in verse 25, we see again Isaiah using the technique of rhetorical questions. And these rhetorical questions have the same point as verse 18, that there is no one or nothing else in the entire universe that's equal to God or is even comparable to him, because he's Lord over the universe and everything in it. Of course, the difference between verse 18 and verse 25 is that in verse 25, it's God himself asking the people. It's God himself saying, hey, who's like me? Tell me if you can compare me to anybody. Isaiah, referring to God then as the Holy One in this verse, as Carla rightly pointed out, is meant to further highlight his otherness, the fact that he is above all of creation. Calling him the Holy One highlights that God is morally perfect, a claim that can be made by no one else. In verse 26, Isaiah again stresses God's otherness and the fact that he rules over creation by mentioning that he has authority even over the stars in the sky. The starry host was worshipped by many of the nations surrounding Israel. So by mentioning that here, Isaiah is illustrating that the stars, the cosmos, are not worthy to be worshipped because, one, they're not self-existent, and two, they're created by God and under his authority like everything else. Further, the vast night sky that seems limitless is not limitless to God. He himself is so vast that he knows not only the number of stars in the sky, but he knows each one by name as well. John Oswald explains the significance of this. He writes, in the ancient world, to know the name of something was to know its essence and thereby have power over it. This shows once again the transcendence of God. He's not part of the cosmos. He's over and above the cosmos as their creator and sustainer. Then we move into the last subsection of the chapter, verses 27 to 31. So what do you see in those final verses that stands out to you?
I got introduced to those 4 verses by a man named Bill Blythe down in Kansas, Crusade for Christ. And he was suffering from a lung problem that he could barely move. And he would be flying that airplane, preaching and stuff. But he told me, I explained this, but I feel like I'm just shot and can't do it anymore. I claim this as a promise. Now, I've been doing that myself lately, God, and I found it to be true that God does have all power, as the first 3 verses bring out. The last one said, if you wait on me, I'll give that to you. I claim that promise and can say, I really do have more energy when I do that.
Okay. Good story. Other thoughts on 27 to 31?
You're right. And walk and not fainted.
Okay. 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 Right. Okay. Yeah, so that God is Lord over everything, from creation to giving strength to the people. He's in control of it all. He's got it all in the palm of his hand. So who are the people of Israel to complain and say that God doesn't hear them or care about them when he's proven over and over again that's not to be the case? That's a very annotated version of what she said, but that's essentially what she said.
Well, I think in our ignorance, we complain. Even though we know the answer, we've read the whole story, we know the book, we know in our hearts what's true, but we still get to a point where, hey, Lord, hurry up.
Impatient.
You know, yeah.
Right.
And he's pointing that out, here, and it's like, God knows all. He knows that we're gonna fall and stumble, and he's gonna be there to pick us up.
Right.
And, these verses, we've heard a zillion times.
Right. Yeah.
They're in songs, they're quoted all the time. These are not new to us, but it's that renewing in these words to us from God.
Yeah.
That he is there. He is holding us in his hand.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Good. Good. Victoria, did you have something?
I was kind of, we're kind of going over it and over it. To me, this is one of the times when we're down and we're feeling sad or weak or whatever, physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever. I feel like that's when God just, because he's so infinite, like so big, I just feel like that's when he gives that spiritual hug that we all need. And that makes me feel good inside. Like it just brings joy to my heart.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like looking at it right now, and it's like I'm feeling that joy right now.
Good. Good.
And it's been nice.
Amen. Amen.
Most promises, it is conditional though. You don't get renewed strength and lack of weariness unless you wait on the Lord.
Right.
This will bring this.
Right. Yeah. So a conditional promise. We have something we have to do as far as waiting on the Lord. Good.
There's nothing insignificant about it. Nothing.
Right. Okay. Nothing insignificant to God. Good. Yeah, so in these verses, Isaiah kind of circles back to his opening question and he concludes his entire discussion in light of what he's expounded in verses 12 to 26. In verse 27, he continues his technique of the rhetorical question to ask God's people why they continue to complain and question and doubt God. Referring to the people as Jacob and as Israel isn't an accident, right? Isaiah does it intentionally to reinforce in the reader's minds the truth that they are God's covenant people. Of course, he wouldn't forget about them or stop caring about them because he made a covenant with their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 28 begins with two more rhetorical questions, this time designed to elicit a positive response. Yes, we do know. Yes, we have heard. Again, Isaiah wants his readers to remember they already knew everything he's telling them about God. God is everlasting. He is the creator, and they can trust in him and rely on him because he doesn't get tired or weary. He's always working in ways that we as humans can't even fathom. Verse 29 shows that God in his infinite power gives strength and power to the weary and weak. God cares about his people. He wants to help them, and he will help them if they seek him. And verses 30 and 31 carry on the theme of God providing strength and power to the weary and the weak. Isaiah first notes in verse 30 that even the most healthy and vital people on earth eventually get worn down. Human strength has its limits. He then goes on in verse 31 to note that God will provide strength and power to those who wait on him, or as the NIV says, who hope in him. God will constantly renew the strength and the faith of the faithful so that they can fly as effortlessly as eagles, metaphorically speaking. They will run, they will not grow weary, they will walk and not be faint. Now, I do think that the translations who transliterate it as those who wait on the Lord is more correct. I don't like the NIV translation here who say those who hope in the Lord. Because the Hebrew word kavah more literally means wait. So it's those who wait on the Lord. And that's an important distinction. Because the whole point of this chapter has been to show God's people that God will act on their behalf in his own time. So they must wait on him. Of the phrase, wait on the Lord, John Oswalt writes this, quote, "This expression implies two things: complete dependence on God and a willingness to allow him to decide the terms. To wait on him is to admit that we have no other help, either in ourselves or in another. Therefore, we are helpless until he acts. By the same token, to wait on him is to declare our confidence in his eventual action on our behalf. Thus, waiting in Hebrew is not merely killing time, but a life of confident expectation. Those who give up their own frantic efforts to save themselves and turn expectantly to God will be able to replace or exchange their worn-out strength for new strength." End quote. Basically, in layman's terms, what we see Isaiah saying in this section is essentially this: based upon everything I've just reminded you about God, how could you possibly think that he's ignoring you or doesn't care about you? Even though you might not see or understand, because God is so radically other from us, you can trust he's at work, and you can lean on him because he's here for you. He will renew your strength each day. That's 27 to 31 in a nutshell. So then how do we fit all of these subsections from verse 12 through 31? How do they fit together to form a unified message? What is the message of verses 12 to 31 as a whole? So if we take everything we've been talking about from verse 12 together, we can see that this section is a poetic, glowing description of who God is. The fall to Babylon would call into question who he is. It makes it seem as if God's just one more local, tribal God who would ultimately be conquered by more powerful empires and more powerful gods. That's what the Babylonian conquest makes it look like, that God is impotent in the face of the Babylonians. So what we see in this section is Isaiah dealing with that question. He's reminding his readers that their God is so much more than a local tribal God. He is the God of the universe. In verses 12 to 26, we see Isaiah explaining that the Lord is incomparable. He alone is the Lord of creation, and as such, he is transcendent as Lord over creation. There's no other being in the universe who can make this claim. God is so much greater. He is so far above every other being in heaven or on earth. In verses 27 to 31, we see that the Lord then is dependable. He's the one who can be counted on and who can be relied on. What this section from verses 12 to 31 shows us ultimately then is God doesn't just want to deliver his people. He can and he will deliver his people. So then kind of the last question regarding the content of the chapter, we broke it ultimately down into two sections, verses 1 to 11 and verses 12 to 31. How do those two sections fit together, and what is the overall message of the entire chapter? Trust God and he is almighty.
And you have two options. Option one is trusting yourself for your idols or whatever, and end up with a bad outcome. Option two is trust in the Lord, and you can have comfort and power.
Okay, good. Yeah, so good answers. This is actually probably the shortest answer I've ever given to any question in this Bible study, because it's pretty simple and straightforward. The first section is an encouragement to the people to take comfort because God is on their side and he's so much greater than they are. The second section then goes on to lay out exactly how God is so much greater than humanity, the basis for why the people should have comfort. So the first section is take comfort because God is great. And the second section is here's how he's great and why you should take comfort. So we end then with our last two regular questions. What does chapter 40 teach us specifically about God?
The Father,
Okay, he's our Father.
and in heaven,
He's in heaven, okay?
I'll be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is heaven.
Okay, good.
Like that one.
Yeah.
God has all the answers and we don't.
Okay, he has all the answers and we don't.
I just remember my head.
Okay, he's almighty, the Holy One.
Creator of all and rules over all.
Okay, creator of all and rules over all. Good.
He not only has the power, but he'll give it to us if we wait on him.
Okay, he not only has the power, but he'll give it to us if we wait on him. Good.
I don't understand that.
It doesn't mean he's going to give us his power like we're going to be God. It just means he gives us the strength and the power to deal with the ups and downs of life and to continue running the race faithfully. Yep.
He does all that because he cares for us.
Okay, he does all that because he cares for us. Yeah, good. All really good answers. A few that I got here. First, this chapter certainly, over and over and over and over again, reminds us that God is other, that he is set apart, that he is holy. This is one characteristic of God that Isaiah repeats in various ways in chapter 40. Second, this chapter reminds us that God is transcendent. He exists separate from and in authority over the entire universe. Third, this chapter reminds us that God is mighty and powerful. Right? This is another theme that is repeated throughout the chapter in various ways. He is more mighty and powerful than even the greatest rulers of the earth. Fourth, this chapter reminds us that God cares about us and wants to take care of and provide for us. This is the whole point of verses, especially verses 29 to 31, and its declaration that he gives power and strength to those who wait on him. He wants to provide for us. He wants to take care of us. Fifth, this chapter reminds us that God works in his time. It's his perfect plan, and he will accomplish what he desires to accomplish in his way on his time. And lastly, how do you think the message of chapter 40 is relevant for us today? Think after all the detail, we would get the message. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to go over it again and again and again. And I think that it's as relevant to us to go over today, and also because there is a whole large number of people who have never heard this.
Right.
Needs to hear this as not only from those people in Isaiah's time to these people as now, knowing that God is, if there is a God, he is in control and really to be control.
Okay. There is a God. He is in control, and we need to let him be in control of our lives. A message people need to hear as much today as they did in Isaiah's day. Very good. Other thoughts on how it's relevant for us today?
I know my mom fought down, but I want you to pray for her today, please.
Okay.
And I want to say a prayer for my honey, Terry Ogletree. He had a real bad heart, and he keeps scaring me all the time. And he can't ride, he can't do Special Olympic or nothing.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on how chapter 40 is relevant for us today? Somebody's got to have something on the relevance besides Teresa. This is usually the question you guys are the most interested in.
It's all relevant. I mean, it's just, it's very black and white.
Okay. Very black and white.
He made it. He's in control of it. He's there for us because we're called his children, and that's why he does what he does.
Okay. Good.
And out of obedience,
Okay. Good. Good. Go ahead, Betty.
So I always felt like I was a grasshopper.
Okay.
And I thought, what if I'm a bug? And God's watching over me all the time and everybody's a bug. What happens when you're a bug and God watches you? Are you really a people or are you a bug? And tonight he said you're a grasshopper. So I was like, okay, this is weird that we're really bugs.
I don't think you're a bug, Betty. I think we are people, but just size-wise in comparison to the greatness of God, we are bugs. Not.
Mine, grasshoppers to him.
Mm-hmm.
Just teeny tiny.
It's my view. Right.
Well, if it also says that God weighs the islands like they're dust particles. So if an entire island is a dust particle to God, how small are we in comparison to God? Good. All right, so a few that I got.
I don't want to make that funny. I mean, I just always thought how small can
Yeah, and I mean it's an important thing to remember, and that's actually one of the things that I got for how this chapter is relevant for us today. It should remind us to be humble, right? We're as feeble as grass, we're as small as grasshoppers, and God is so big that to him islands are like specks of dust. So if he's that big and we're that small, what reason do we have for pride?
And that's what I think in my head all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Richie, do you have something?
No, I'm thinking about, even though we go like grasshopper, as we wait on the Lord, become like the eagle.
Yeah,
To me, that's a step up.
right. No, that's a good point. It's a good point. Yeah, good. So a few other ones that I got. First, I think this passage should give us great comfort in remembering that God is on our side and working on our behalf, just as he was for the people of Judah. Second, I think this passage reminds us to be patient. God works in his time, not in our time. Those who wait on the Lord will soar on wings as eagles, run and not grow weary, walk and not be faint. So we must be patient. We must wait on the Lord to act in his time. I think this passage also reminds us of our need to submit to God. Right? This chapter really drives home the point that God is God and we are not. Therefore, we must submit to him as God. And finally, I think this passage reminds us of the need to be thankful. The God of the universe, who created all things, who is Lord over all things, loves us and wants to take care of us. That's a pretty big reason to be thankful. And he gave us Jesus, which is another reason to be thankful. That's all I have. Any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Through this, when you're thinking of the vastness
Mm-hmm.
of the creation, and our minds are so limited.
Right.
And, when you think of, I mean, we're here on this earth, in this solar system, in that universe, and all those, the oxygen only goes so far, and then you need, like when you were saying in a plane, you have to have decompression to go where you're going to go.
Right.
All of that. And it's mind-boggling just to do that one little thing of how much knowledge goes into that one little thing.
Mm-hmm.
And God is so way beyond all of that.
Right.
He created all of that. But all those layers, there's so many layers of our existence.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the Earth and our solar system and in our galaxy and and how it all works. It's just mind-boggling. And for someone to not.
Does it boggle your mind more that there's people out there that think that all of that is an accident?
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine how you could even come to that conclusion. If you look at anything.
Well,
In creation.
I think you're 100% right, but I think the answer into why people think that is here in Isaiah 40, right? Isaiah says that we cannot fathom God. So I think sometimes people, because they can't fathom God, just decide he doesn't exist. It's easier to say he doesn't exist than to wrap your brain around how vast he really is.
Right. Yeah, that's true. You just aren't going to accept it.
Yep.
You just won't accept it because they don't understand it.
Right.
But it's just boggles me.
Yeah, it does. It does.
I'm this one little person sitting in this room on this earth in this whole thing that is so monstrous that I can't even fathom.
Yeah, you're one person sitting in this room in this little town in the state of California on the continent of North America on this world, and God has the entire universe in the palm of his hand. How much smaller are we than God? You know? Richie?
And he all makes it work.
Yeah. It all goes together according to his plan. He has it under control. He has it under control. Go ahead, Richie.
It's my highly biased opinion that all these promises, like, soaring with the eagles and extra strength, all these promises were not only applicable to people in that time, but as Christians, modern Israel, so to speak, in God's eyes, we can use those and
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I don't...
like a checkbook,
Right.
we can accept it if we want.
Yeah, I don't think God's promises to his people change. God didn't make new promises to Christians. We are heirs to the promises he made originally. And the only difference between us and God's people in the Old Testament is we have the privilege of living after Jesus. They didn't. So, I 100% agree with that. All right, if there's nothing else, let me close this in a word of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for who you are. We thank you for how vast you are. We thank you for the promises that you made to us and you continue to fulfill each and every day. We thank you that for how vast you are, you still care about each one of us individually. You still are involved in our lives. You still provide for us and take care of us. Lord, it would be so easy for a God as big as you with so much that you're involved with every cell of every human you're involved with. It would be so easy for you to not care about little old me, little old anybody, but you do because you created us and you love us. And so we thank you for that. We thank you most of all for Jesus, who you sent to die for us who are like mere grasshoppers, that you loved us enough to send your Son to pay the penalty for our sin so that we might know eternity in your kingdom. What a good God you are. We thank you for the promises of Isaiah chapter 40, for the comfort, the peace, and the hope that it brings. I pray that each person here will take that comfort and that hope into this week until we can meet together again on Sunday to worship you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I've got the notes for chapter 40 and the past few chapters over there. Remember, this is the last one until after the first of the year. We're looking at Tuesday, January 9th as the day to pick up. Thanks, everybody.